Hello, YouTube. This is Pastor Bryan here. Welcome to all of you who are joining. I know we got a couple of you tuning in immediately. I think somebody popped in a little bit ago just to give the thumbs up and then left. So I don't know if you're still watching, but if that was you, thank you. That was very kind of you. So we are going to be talking about a couple of things today. Mainly, we're going to be talking about the fourth commandment, which, as you can see, as I can see, I've been having some camera issues lately. My face looks really shiny right now. So I wonder if that'll help. I don't know. I still feel pretty shiny. Anyway, maybe that'll help a lot. Yeah, I feel better about that. Anyway. Welcome, everyone. I hope that you're doing well today. Kind of a little midweek bit for us today, talking about the fourth commandment, talking about life and death, talking about how to rest in the time of COVID. I don't know about you, but rest is something that has been kind of hard to come by, and we're going to talk about that. Kind of what does it mean biblically to rest or to receive rest? In a sense, biblically speaking, rest is almost a kind of discipline. And I know as soon as I say that word, that doesn't sound restful. But we're gonna start talking about that now. So as always, if you have questions or things to add, or you want to chime in, that's what the comment box is for. Is that what it's called? The YouTube chat box, live chat, whatever. You do need a YouTube account to do that, and so which I think is the same as a Google account. But so if you have a Google account, you have a YouTube account, I think. But anyway, feel free to toss in your comments or questions and on all these kinds of things. It really helps me out, especially to clarify a point or just to know that I'm not just talking to a screen, to a wall, shouting out into the vague nothingness that is YouTube. And so with that, let's start talking about the fourth commandment. So I'm going to jump over to my Logos window here. Exodus 20 verse 8, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work. Okay, remember the Lord created work before the fall, so work itself is not evil. Work is a good thing, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord, to Yahweh your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your livestock. Even the animals got to rest. Or the sojourner who's within your gates. For in 6 days, so here's the reason or the grounding. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven, and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore, Yahweh, the Lord, blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Okay, so this central concept of the Sabbath day is that we have a couple of things in play. One idea that's important, that's in play, is rest, and another idea that's in play is remember. So you'll notice that the first three commandments, and in fact most of the commandments, are a negative prohibition, right? Thou shalt not, or you shall not. Okay, but the fourth commandment about the Sabbath is not a thou shalt not, it's a thou shall. It's a thou shall remember. So it's our first positive commandment that we get rather than a negative prohibition in terms of the grammar, in terms of the language. And so we're going to jump over to our larger catechism. We've read this already. What is the fourth commandment? And then 116, what is required in the fourth commandment? So here's what we're going to talk about. Here's how we're going to get into the meat of this. The fourth commandment requires of all men the sanctifying or keeping holy to God such set times as he has appointed in his word. Expressly 1 whole day in 7, which was the seventh from the beginning of the world to the resurrection of Christ, what we would call Saturday, and the first day of the week ever since, and so to continue to the end of the world, which is the Christian Sabbath, and in the New Testament is called the Lord's Day. Okay? So where does that come from? Where does this idea, so in other words, what our catechism's giving us here is this sense in which for God's people, from creation to the resurrection of Jesus, The Sabbath day was a day of rest on what we would call Saturday, the last day of the week. And then from the resurrection to the end of the world, we have this thing called the Lord's Day, or colloquially, presently, what we call Sunday. Okay, and so this is this idea of the Christian Sabbath, and where does that come from? Well, you have a couple of what we might call hints in the Bible that the early church, as early as the book of Acts, began to meet on the first day of the week. All right, so one of those is Acts chapter 20, verse 7. On the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread. Okay, first day of the week, gathered together to break bread, and so this is. This points toward this practice that was, I guess you could say picking up steam during the time in the early church. And it makes sense if you think about it, because the time of rest, the Sabbath day that was given as God's gift to Israel it pointed to his goodness. It pointed to the completion of his work, right? God rested on the seventh day in creation, not because he was tired. He didn't rest because he was tired or weary or frustrated or anything like that. He rested because he was finished, right? And so when was the great work of our salvation accomplished and finished? It would be on the day of the resurrection, when our salvation fully, completely secured, and now as we've sang before, rising he justified freely forever all who know and love him. And so this is what's been going on for as long as there have been Christians. Christians have recognized that our day of rest, as distinguished from the old covenant day of rest, is to be on the day that the Lord, you could say that the Lord rested from his work, in that sense that he was resurrected, resting from the work of pulling us out of the clutches of sin, death, and the devil, right? By rising again from the grave. And so that's the day that we rest and celebrate. We see the early church doing that. Another example, I'll put it in here, would be 1 Corinthians 16. And that's going to begin at verse 1. Concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, Paul writes, so you are also to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, so there will be no collecting when I come. So here's Paul saying, essentially, this is the day that you're setting aside to give the offering for the collection that I'll pick up when I come. Now, look, there's no explicit reference there to that's the day of what we might call your church meeting. But Paul is addressing all of them collectively together and saying each of you is to put something aside on this day. Why that day? More than likely it's because that's the day when they were meeting together, because we see the early church practicing this in Acts. And as long as we've had material on the early church, we've had the early church meeting on Sunday. Revelation 1:10, when John has his vision, he says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. Right? On the Lord's day, that's where we get the terminology for it. And again, within from the earliest stuff that we have, the earliest information that we have, you had Jewish Christians, right? Jews who came to believe in the resurrected Messiah Jesus, meeting together on what we would call Sunday, the first day of the week, the resurrection day, and celebrating it as the Lord's Day. You might say the Lord's Day of victory, the Lord's Day of completion, even the Lord's Day of resting, that is resting from his work of resting us, pulling us out of the jaws of sin and death. And so that's kind of a very, very, very short case for why is it that Christians celebrate the Sabbath on Sunday. I'm aware, of course, there are groups that want to stick to a Saturday Sabbath, and that's a fine thing to do. I mean, there's no sin in it. It's not prohibited anywhere. But if they were going to say that by celebrating it on Sunday that the rest of us are in sin, well, then they've got to reckon with the overwhelming majority of the early church, or at the very least, the overwhelming majority of information that we have about the early church. This is part of the trouble of church history, that the further back you go, the less information we have, okay? And so, obviously, the New Testament being the one of the most helpful, if not the most helpful source about information on the earliest days of Christianity, but even extra biblical sources that we do have, but the further back you go, kind of the fewer they get. And so this is why Christians practice the Sabbath, celebrate the Sabbath, rest from their work on Sunday, on the first day of the week. So let's then having said that, let's unpack a bit more of what Sabbath means, because I'm pretty well convinced that most of American evangelicalism has no concept of Sabbath, other than, well, we might have the concept like it's a day off of work, and maybe if you're a particular kind of evangelical, you think Christian business owners ought to close their stores on that day so that their employees can rest. I would agree with that, by the way. But how exactly do we keep Sabbath today? Now, let me just say this in passing. It's very unsatisfying for me, for anyone to say, well, Sabbath is one of those Old Testament laws and we don't really keep those anymore. No, it's in the Ten Commandments, which Jesus seemed quite comfortable repeating and building on, as did the apostles, by the way. And so that's really insufficient for me to say that Sabbath keeping is simply like part of the stuff that's not necessarily binding on us anymore. So let's talk about that then. So question 117 in our larger catechism: the Sabbath or Lord's Day is to be sanctified by a holy resting all the day, not only from such works as are at all times sinful. So in other words, resting from sinful stuff, but even from such worldly employments and recreations as are on other days lawful, and making it our delight to spend the whole time, except so much of it as to be taken up in works of necessity and mercy, in the public and private exercises of God's worship. And to that end we are to prepare our hearts, and with such foresight, diligence, moderation, to dispose and seasonably dispatch our worldly business, that we may be the more free and fit for the duties of the day. Okay, so let's unpack that point by point. First bit, it's a holy resting all the day, not just from sin, but from such things that would not be sinful on any other day. And so you have this bit, worldly employments and recreations, okay? Sometimes within Reformed circles, Presbyterian circles, referred to as the Sabbath, the recreation clause, okay? And lots of young men who are getting ordained, if they're in a confessing denomination, I suppose old men can get ordained as well, but men who are getting ordained and entering into full-time vocational ministry, if they are in a confessional denomination that requires them to subscribe to the confession, meaning kind of sign on the dotted line saying, yes, this confession confesses what I actually confess, what I actually believe. Within my denomination, the EPC, and other Presbyterian denominations as well, not all of them, but some of them, there is an understanding that you can take exception to certain things. That is, you're saying, broadly, generally speaking, I agree with most of this confession, except for these points. And so long as those points do not strike at the substance of the faith, the essentials of the faith, the things that are, we might say, foundational to the gospel, foundational to the Christian religion, then you can take those exceptions. When I was ordained, I did take the recreation exception. It's pretty common, actually, even from such worldly employments and recreations as are on other days lawful. So if you confess that, you're going to have to square off with this reality that you can't really watch football games then, and that's the easy go-to example, right? Since then, I did take exception to it. Since then, I've really rethought that, and I'll tell you why. The reason why I took the exception, again, just to be clear, the reason why I'm saying I took exception to that line to say I think most recreation is okay on the Sabbath, is because I had a sense that certainly there are godly ways to engage in recreation that are indeed restful. There's that word again. We're going to talk specifically about what it means to rest Sabbathly. But since I've kind of been reflecting on it more and more, the more I think about it, the more I think, what it's getting at there is not that the act of recreation is bad or sinful, or even that the act of recreation somehow becomes sinful just because it happens on a Sunday or whatever. I think what it's getting at, just to ask you this, if you are a big football fan, right? If you're a really big fan of football or basketball or baseball, have you ever sinned while watching a game? Have you ever gotten really angry while watching? In Louisiana, all I have to do is say, have you ever gotten really angry during an LSU game? Have you ever sinned during an LSU game? And so this is, and part of what I'm kind of pushing toward is to say that we take for granted, we undervalue, maybe we don't take seriously how much of our recreation is an opportunity to sin. Now, that doesn't mean the recreation itself is bad, right? Some people can't play a board game because they're going to sin if they lose. They're a really sore loser. But that would be an example of kind of what I'm talking about. That it tends to be that our recreation brings with it temptations to sin. Okay, brings with it temptations to sin, and that's what's behind even resting from recreation. And the more that I've thought about it, let's leave aside for a minute that a lot of people are not going to be watching the NFL for reasons that have nothing to do with Sabbath practices. Let's not talk about that, right? But leaving that aside, the reality is that I think that if we understood the concept of rest, we'd be getting closer to why resting might in fact include your recreation. Okay, and so so now would seem to be a good time to address that. And so, Laura, I see your question. I'm going to deal with it. I'm not going to forget you. Don't worry. So let's talk then about the concept of rest, because I think this really, really, really gets misunderstood. What does it mean to rest in the Sabbath sense of the word? Okay. We get a sense of that in the answer in the Catechism. Let's see. To make it our delight, here we go. Making it our delight to spend the whole time, that is the whole time of the Sabbath day, except so much of it is to be taken up in works of necessity and mercy, in the public and private exercises of God's worship. Okay? Public and private exercise. So public would be what we call going to church, gathering with God's people. Private exercises of worship would be watching maybe a sermon on YouTube, or reading your Bible, or praying in your room, or even kind of listening to Christian music or reading Christian books, or things like this. Those would be sort of private exercises of worship. And so that's what the day is for. In other words, it's a day to focus on the things of God. Okay? And so you begin to get the sense then that when recreation is removed, it's not because recreation is bad. It's because recreation does not focus your mind and heart on the things of God in the same way that engaging in public and private worship does. So think of rest like this, okay? So the book of Hebrews talks about this Sabbath rest that we're waiting for, right? This Sabbath rest for the people of God. There still remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, Hebrews 4. That we're still waiting for this final rest to come about. And what is that rest from? At the very least, that rest has to be a rest from sinning. A rest from sin and striving and all the junk and the garbage that comes with a broken Genesis 3 world, right? And so A lot of times when we talk about Sabbath, what we are mainly, at least what I'm mainly thinking of when I talk about Sabbath is like, that's a day when I don't have to think about stuff related to my vocation or my job, which is true. Sabbath is not less than that. But what Sabbath is really about then, what Sabbath is really about is rest from sinning, preview of heaven, okay? And so the reason why recreation is prohibited in the confession and the catechisms and in the Reformed tradition as part of Sabbath keeping is not because recreation is bad. And it's not even because of some slippery slope argument that recreation will inevitably lead you to sin. Rather, it's because this is the day that you're setting aside to, so far as it depends on you, you're not even going to give sinning a chance. All right. Now, again, immediately when I say that, some of you just hear a law. All you kind of hear is that that's a law to practice. Yeah, Laura asked a good question. Shouldn't we rest from sin all the time? Yes. And so I'll tell you, just about everything I've said about Sabbath so far, you could punch back with that. And so it's not that we do less than refraining from sin on the Sabbath, but let's be honest. A lot of sinning, a lot of opportunities to sin come about when you walk out your front door and start engaging with other human beings that you work with, that you get irritated by, that you get annoyed by, all those kinds of things. These are the sort of the myriad opportunities for your sinning. What Sabbath does is it is ideally cuts back on your opportunities to sin. That's the idea. Okay? So by reducing what you are doing, by reducing your doing, you could put it that way, by reducing your doing, you are reducing the opportunities for sin. By taking all of your doing for that day and orienting it toward the things of God, you are reducing the opportunities, which you can't not do that every day if you actually want to eat, right? Because you got to go to work or whatever. You got to go to the grocery store to buy food, or whatever have you. And again, so there are some very legalistic ways you can apply this, very intense ways you can apply this. And I'm not going to attempt to iron out like all the minutia of Sabbath practices. I can tell you where I am on it. That more and more I am convinced that resting on the Sabbath, that the Bible's call to rest on the Sabbath, the scriptural call to rest on the Sabbath, is not be lazy. That's what we hear when we hear rest. We hear now is the time where I'm supposed to be lazy. And so, but that's not what Sabbath rest is getting at. Sabbath rest is I'm now going to engage myself. Oh yeah, Laura, but it's not the isolation that causes you not to sin or whatever. But Laura, you're hitting on a very good qualifying question. Better or different than risking sin, speaking of the gospel to others. So if you look back at the, so I guess that is the left side of your screen. No, the right side it would be. Sorry. On the right side of your screen, I'm on the left side of your screen, but on the right side of your screen, you've got, look at that parenthetically bit. Except so much of it is as to be taken up in works of necessity and mercy. So these are kind of the two exceptional things for Sabbath. Two kinds of work that it's fine for you to do on the Sabbath. Okay, works of necessity. That means in order to keep living. Okay, so you gotta eat, right, to keep living. That's fine. Which may involve cooking dinner. That's fine. So that's kind of that's a work of necessity. It's what happens for you to keep on living. Okay, and what's the defense for that? The defense for that is what you remember in the Gospels when Jesus' disciples are walking through grain fields and they are picking the heads of grain off and rubbing them together in their hands, which formed a kind of bread paste, and then they ate it. Okay, now, according to the Pharisees, that counted as Sabbath work, or working on the Sabbath, violating the fourth commandment, essentially. And so, but Jesus defends them and says that the Sabbath is not made for man is not made for the Sabbath, rather the Sabbath is made for man. So in other words, man was not built to be a super highly precise Sabbath keeping robot. Rather, the Sabbath is God's gift to man for his relief, not for his anxiety. Okay. However, I would say that if affluent, comfortable, busy-bodied 21st century Americans were to start intentionally keeping Sabbath, first couple of months are going to be a little bit anxiety-inducing because it's so foreign to us. Y'all, it's so foreign to us. So that's that. I'm kind of getting off topic a bit. But so works of necessity, you have to live, and works of mercy. In other words, if it's a work that involves loving your neighbor, serving your neighbor, that's perfectly fine to do on the Sabbath. This is why. So, for instance, if somebody in my congregation was a police officer or a firefighter or a emergency service ambulance driver, I still want them working on Sabbaths. Yeah, and so that would be a work of mercy. So works of necessity, keeping you alive. Works of mercy, keeping others alive. And helping and loving and serving others, of course, are exceptions to this clause about what constitutes work on the Sabbath. And so that, Laura, would be better or different, risking to speak the gospel to others. So isolation was the example I gave. But you have to remember, again, when I said not going out and about, I'm not talking about morticians, Bobby, got to keep working. I'm not talking about isolation, because if you go back up, what was the fourth commandment? Remember the language? You shall not do any work, not you, not your son, not your daughter, manservant, maidservant, cattle, stranger in your gates. It's not isolated. It's you and all the people with you. So yeah, you still got to deal with those people who are with you. But it's not by isolation. I don't mean you in the house by yourself, all alone, and that's what keeps you from sinning. That kind of isolation probably, can actually lead to more sin. But anyway, so that's a good thing to keep in mind. But by isolation from people, I don't necessarily mean, because again, you're gathering with other people on the Sabbath for worship, for public worship. So maybe the isolation or the explanation I gave that tilted toward isolation was not the best way of explaining it. But to try and get us inside this biblical idea of rest, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to move you past just the simple idea of passivity or inaction or not moving or staying home from work, so to speak. It's not like laziness. That's not what we're getting at. And so it is rather taking a day to get a little taste of the not sinning. So in other words, when we are with Jesus, where do you think our thoughts are going to be? They're probably going to be on Jesus. Okay? All the time. That doesn't mean we won't also see each other, talk to each other, be with each other, rejoice. I think we'll do all those things in the new heavens and the new earth. But in the new heavens and the new earth, in that last Sabbath rest that we'll experience forever, guys, when we're with each other forever, our minds will be all the time soaked in godliness, if I can put it that way. And so Sabbath rest is you're meant to enter in to get a little taste of that. To say, what would it be like to be saturated, to have my mind oriented toward godliness? Are you going to fail in that? Of course you are. So it's this is what I mean, that Sabbath rest is itself a kind of discipline, very unnatural for us, by the way. And so I mean, I'll tend to, like on Sundays, if I can avoid going out, I will. That doesn't mean I think it's a sin to go out, but I'll try to avoid restaurants. I'll try to avoid food delivery. That way I'm not making other people work on the Sabbath, and that's that kind of grows out of just my own conviction on that. Some people, I don't think going this far is necessary, but I knew some people, particularly in Scotland when I was there, who would cook all their Sunday food on Saturday. So that they could do the kind of least amount of sort of food prep possible, the least amount of work on a Sunday possible. They'd have kind of, Sunday dinner would always be Saturday leftovers or or it would be something quick that they had prepared the previous day or something like that. And again, how you exercise these things is in large part up to you, because the command to rest is given. Not a lot of details are given, right? Not a lot of details are given in the Bible. That's where the Pharisees got into trouble. You see, the chief problem with the Pharisees was that they believed that God's word was not clear enough, that God had not said enough, that more words had to be added because what God had said was insufficient. Okay? So God said, don't work on the Sabbath. Well, like if I have to journey somewhere, how far can I go? Well, the scriptures don't say. Okay, so then we're going to prescribe, maybe you've heard this term in the scriptures, a Sabbath day's journey. Yeah, we're going to prescribe precisely how much this Sabbath day's journey is, and you can go on and on and on. There were things that counted as work and didn't count as work, and it was very sort of confusing. My point is that the problem with Phariseeism was rooted in this idea of we have a law from God. It's not really clear enough for us to know, like 100% in all circumstances, what it looks like. So we're going to prescribe exactly what it has to look like all the time. And that's where the Pharisees really went wrong. Okay. And so yeah, something to keep in mind. Now, let me see here. Going down. Now would probably be a good time to look at Laura's question. Let's see, Laura, thank you. I have a question regarding Sunday's sermon. How do you balance not fearing death, but also not being nihilistic? The idea of death being better than life invites a mindset of why am I still here when it's better to be there? That makes death seem inviting. Yeah, it's very good. And that's actually kind of what I'm going to address this coming Sunday. So the sermon for this past Sunday was not afraid to die. And then the sermon for this coming Sunday is not ashamed to live. And so, because you do have to keep those two things in balance. So Laura, you're not entirely wrong. The gospel of Jesus and the promise of the resurrection and the life everlasting does mean that that the only thing death can do is deliver to us the gift of being with Jesus. That's the only thing it can do to us. Okay, is deliver to us the gift of being with Jesus. And so the idea of death being better than life, well, but it's not that death is better than life. It's that what comes after death is better than life. Okay, and so make sure that's very important. It's not that death is better than life. It's what comes after death is better than life. And so to be nihilistic, though is to love death, not to love the second life. That's a big difference right there. It's to be nihilistic is almost to be in love with the idea of the cessation of existence, the ceasing of existence, rather than eternity. Now, Luther had this terminology that he used. He actually said the Bible gives us what Luther called the sweet names of death. Things like having fallen asleep, having passed in from death to life, things like that. That the terminology the Bible, the New Testament uses, does have kind of a connotation of sweetness with it. And you said that's my issue. I feel more afraid of life than of death. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, insert your Hamilton quote here, right? Dying is easy, living is harder. So I mean, that's a very human thing to say. I think that makes good sense, Laura. I think that's okay. It's not a comfortable thing to be afraid, of course. But we're not to fear death, and to some extent, the anxieties that we bear in this life, they come out of living this life. Living this life is hard. It's going to work is hard. Particularly being with unbelievers is hard because you long for them to know Jesus. And so all those things, yes, that's right. And so it's good to make the distinction, I think, Laura, that you're trying to make, which is we are not telling people, like, the Christian hope is not bound up in suicide, nor do we romanticize suicide, because taking life, including taking life from yourself, is a sin. And so we want to be very clear about that we don't glorify it. But also that we recognize that death has been defanged. Again, what I said on Sunday was the stinger has been taken out. So we are not afraid of what's on the other side. Laura says, a close friend of mine struggles with the same thing, but isn't a Christian, doesn't have the hope. So is that person afraid of death? Is it similar? Well, it depends on the person completely. Like, that question's easier to answer if they're a Christian because they have a standard for knowing what comes after death. If they don't have a standard for knowing what comes after death, then they're really just kind of left with either paganism or the movies or, something like that. That's really going to depend on the person. All they've kind of got is a vague idea of, like, maybe they believe something, or maybe they just believe in disintegration and annihilation. Just you die and just that's it. You cease to exist. I think that I think there's something in the human heart that screams the opposite. Like, the reason why we don't want to die is because we know that we were actually wired to live forever. Anyway, so there's kind of a quick overview for you, Laura. These are good things to be thinking and talking about. But as with all things, this reminds me of the advice that Luther, I'm quoting Luther a lot today, that Luther gave on predestination. He said that predestination is like this glorious doctrine that the Lord has given us that could very well drive you insane if you try to pick it apart and parse it all out and understand every corner of it, right? And so you notice that whenever Paul brings up predestination, it makes him rejoice. It makes him delight. Who am I that from all eternity past the Lord would bring me of all people into his kingdom to be with him forever? That's what predestination did for Paul. It caused him to rejoice. It didn't cause him to be sort of depressed or kind of in philosophical headspins and in endless confusion and unsteadiness and uncertainty. And Luther's advice was, if predestination does that to you, you need to stop and you need to go find something else to read and to study and to reflect on. And seek help from your pastor on these things if you want to continue talking about kind of how to process predestination. I would give similar advice here about death and the second life. If it's driving you to sort of like morbid darkness and nihilism, then maybe it's time to look in and focus on some other things, because that's not what the concept is meant to give to the Christian. So when the Christian reflects on a Christian understanding of death and what comes after death, again, same thing, it causes us to rejoice. And if the direction that we go with it is kind of a morbid nihilism, then that's not our reaction to it is not being shaped by Scripture. That doesn't mean you're not a Christian. It just means that in that moment, your reaction is not being shaped by the revelation of God. So the Lord wants to show you don't have to be afraid of death anymore. It's not your friend, it's still your enemy. That would, I suppose, be the answer to the nihilism. Death is not your friend, it's still your enemy. It tears apart your body and soul. That was never meant to happen. It deprives your loved ones of you, at least temporarily. That was never meant to happen. It causes grief and pain in the world. It's not as things should be, but what is the only thing it can do for you? The only thing it can do for you is deliver you into the hands of Jesus if you know him, right? So I'm gonna pivot here. I'm gonna pop the clutch and go back briefly to Sabbath, and then if there's other stuff on that, we can jump back to it. I love talking about this. Thank you, Laura. Let's see. Charge of keeping Sabbath. Why is it directed to essentially heads of families? That's the nature of the question. So you notice in the question, you're given the household list, your son, your daughter, your male servant, female servant, this list that would have been tracked by the head of the household. And so why is it that remember the Sabbath, this charge is given to more especially directed to governors of families and other superiors? The answer is really interesting. It's especially directed to governors, heads of families, other superiors, because they are bound not only to keep it themselves, but that it be observed by those under their charge. And because they are because they are prone oftentimes to hinder them by employments of their own. So this is why when I was a teacher at our high school here, I never gave my students tests on a Monday. I'm pretty sure. Maybe if you're one of my graduates is watching, they can call me out. But I'm pretty sure that I never gave any of my students a test on a Monday because I didn't want them working on a Sunday. So that's kind of how I didn't have sons, daughters, male servants, female servants. I didn't have any livestock. Didn't have any pets. So the way that I kept the Sabbath with relation to my students was to say, I'm going to do my best to make sure that I'm not even going to tempt you with work to do on the Sabbath. And so let's see, what sins are forbidden in the fourth commandment? Then omissions of the duties required, careless, negligent, unprofitable performing of them. A good reminder that you can ritualistically perform the commandments of God in a way that's not profitable for you or anyone else. Being weary of them. Oh man. Just take a second with that one. Being weary of what God has said. All profaning the day by idleness. There it is, right? So rest does not equal laziness. Rest does not equal idleness. And doing that which is in itself sinful by all needless works, words, and thoughts about our worldly employments and recreation. So there's that recreation clause again. Some of you might be thinking, how does a pastor keep a Sabbath? Very good question. So my general practice is, and it's kind of, I'm like freely acknowledging this is not a perfect way to do it because pastors, we have to work on the Sabbath, like very naturally. Our employment, our work is necessarily happens on the Sabbath. And so how do we kind of work that out? So generally my practice is, I guess in one way you could say, I take 2 or at least 1.5 Sabbaths. So on Sunday, I do try to stay in line with this explanation of the commandment as best I can on a Sunday, basically from about noon to bedtime. These are things I do try to practice. But also, the elders of our church have given me a day off, which is Friday, where, insofar as I can, I do my best to refrain from stuff that's related to my job. And how far does that go? Well, according to our catechism, works, words, and thoughts about our worldly employments, right? And so, as best I can, I try not to talk about church stuff on Friday. I try not to think about maybe some of the challenges, frustrations, fears in my job. Lots of fears in my job, as there are in every job. Try not to let my mind dwell on those things, but instead invest myself in better use of time. Do I do this perfectly? No. Do I do it well? Sometimes. It's a discipline that you have to develop. And I know some of you are thinking like, man, how is it that you have to develop a discipline to rest? That doesn't sound restful at all. And I would say just the concept of rest, it's because we Western Americans, we confuse rest with leisure. We think those two are the same thing. Leisure is good. It's important. That, if I can put it this way, I was going to say that kind of rest, but I don't even want to encourage that. I would say that kind of absence of work, that kind of relief from work is important. But it's not Sabbath rest. Like leisure and idleness are not the same thing as rest. Rest is something that's good for us. It's made for us. It's made to help us. It's made to benefit us. It's made to grow us. And the Puritans applied this in a really kind of interesting way, because if you were living in Puritan times, you didn't have, you couldn't go to Kroger, you couldn't go to Albertsons, you couldn't go to Walmart, you couldn't go to the grocery store to get your food just any old time you wanted. You tended to have 1, maybe 2, but usually 1 day a week where the farmer and the blacksmith and the lady with the berry bushes and whatever, they would all come in the same place, what we would call today a farmer's market. to sell their wares. And what you would do is you would buy enough for the week. You would buy whatever you needed for the week. And so the Puritans said that the Sabbath was the market day of the soul, where you are storing up what you need for the week, spiritually speaking. Now, I'm not saying like all of your daily devotional time, but rather there's a kind of rest from the things of this world that your soul needs, okay? Well, how do you do that while still living in this world? Sabbath keeping practice is an attempt to do that, however imperfectly, okay? And I think the biggest danger in Sabbath keeping, or rather, the biggest threat to Sabbath keeping is giving up because you realize you can't do it perfectly. That's, I think, what we're most prone to do. Just kind of giving up on the whole thing because we can't do it perfectly. So what reasons are annexed to the fourth commandment? The more to enforce it. So in other words, what's the why? What's the why is it that you'd want to go about living your life obeying this commandment? The reasons annexed to the fourth commandment, the more to enforce it, are taken from the equity of it, that is, God allowing us 6 days of the 7 for our own affairs, reserving but one for himself. In these words, 6 days you labor and do all your work, from God's challenging a special propriety, in that day. The 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. From the example of God, who in 6 days made heaven, earth, sea, all that is in them, rest on the 7th day, and from that blessing which God put upon the day, not only in sanctifying it to be a day for his service, but in ordaining it to be a means of blessing to us in our sanctifying it. In other words, just to summarize all that very quickly, God did it, so we should do it. That's the easiest. So God did it. God rested from his work. And so we, as God's people, as God imitators, one of the ways we imitate God is to rest from our work as well. Now, this is where it gets really cool. Why is the word remember set in the beginning of the fourth commandment? Remember, talked about earlier, this is a positive commandment. It's our first positive commandment, not a negative commandment. And I don't mean positive good, negative bad. It's just a grammatical distinction. The first commandment that doesn't include the word... that is not set up with the phrase "you shall not." Rather, it's set up with the word remember. Remember the Sabbath day. Why? Because of the great benefit of remembering it, we being thereby helped in our preparation to keep it, and in keeping it, to better keep all the rest of the commandments, and to continue a thankful remembrance of the great benefits of creation and redemption, which contain a short abridgment of religion, that is a summary of our faith, and partly because we are very ready to forget it. Okay? So God tells us to remember this commandment because we're very prone to forget it. For that there is less light of nature for it, and yet it restrains our natural liberty in things that are other times lawful. Are you beginning to see? What our catechism is very wisely saying is that your flesh is going to particularly struggle with this one because you have to forbid yourself from things that are not sins. That's why he says remember. Because the work of forbidding yourself from things that are not sinful, right, on other days, is really hard. Because your flesh just goes, wait, I know that's fine. It's fine every other day, right? It's harder. It's harder to do. Laura says, the way this is put is quite helpful. Well, thank you. I've recently learned that a lot of the time I'm experiencing sensory overload, or I'm overwhelmed and I have to shut down even the fun stuff. That's interesting, Laura. Are you saying, if I'm understanding you right, you're saying like that Sabbath might help that? Is that what you mean? I don't want to misinterpret your words, but yeah. And so because this commandment's a bit more difficult for us to keep. And I just think that's a fascinating way. And like of all the 10 commandments, which one is the one that we're most ready to be like, well, that one doesn't apply to us, is the one that says, remember. Something to think about. It comes but once in 7 days, and many worldly business comes between, and too often take off our minds from thinking of it, either to prepare for it or to sanctify it, and that Satan with his instruments much labor to blot out to blot out the glory and even the memory of it. God forgive us. To bring in all irreligion and impiety. All right. And so it's almost like, it's the day where we practice heaven. That's the idea. It's the day where we practice heaven. No, don't you do that every day? In some sense, yeah, but in some sense, no. So it's the practice of heavenly life in a different sort of way. By resting from all things which would distract us from remembering that this life is not the main thing. Okay? Now, and that's why I really had to rethink, everything like the stuff about like watching football. And again, there might be other reasons you might not be watching football, or if football is even going to happen, for goodness sake. But there are plenty of ways that a football game would bring you right back into my life is all about life in this world. Whether it's the intensity of the game, or whether it's what's the other aspect of that? The commercials, right? Anyway, but I'm not, and I've made this clear with my congregation. I want people keeping Sabbath. I want people keeping Sabbath. Whether or not someone decides to take an exception to the recreation clause, I leave up to their conscience, right? Because I did it. I took an exception to the recreation clause. I have since kind of started rethinking that, and really kind of going over, well, is that actually a good thing to keep? Maybe I don't want to give that up as part of my kind of tradition and history. But also I think that there's real goodness in it. So I'm not here to tell you that you can't watch football. I'm here to tell you that if you have never wondered whether or not you ought to or ought not to, you should at least ask the question. And so any other questions about Sabbath? That basically wraps up my time talking about Sabbath. And I very much look forward to talking about this. Oh, I remembered there was one more thing I wanted to mention because, and I'm very surprised. I guess, John Lombard, if you can hear me, maybe John couldn't make it today, but I really expected John to bring this up just to mess with me. And that is Colossians 2:16. Let's talk briefly about Colossians 2:16. All right, 2 and 16. Okay. Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Now, some have used this text to say, don't let anybody judge you, ... about a Sabbath. And the way they interpret that is to say, if you decide not to practice Sabbath at all, don't listen to anybody, maybe like me, for instance, who would tell you that that's a bad idea. Okay? Is that what Paul is saying? Okay? So I'm going to, rather than try and kind of slow walk you to the answer, I'm going to give you the answer straight up and then explain it. Okay? In essence, there are two kinds of Sabbaths in the Bible. There is the Sabbath day, which we've just spent all this time talking about, referenced in the fourth commandment. And then there were Sabbaths, plural. And the Sabbaths were attached to either the beginning or the end or both of a festival. Okay? So you'd have these Sabbaths, and the reason why it's plural is because the festivals are happening year round. And it's also because they're special, they're set apart. These are special days that signal the beginning of a feast, the beginning of a festival, the end of a feast, the end of a festival, or both. Those were called, let me see, I had it written down here. Let's see. First day Sabbaths or last day Sabbaths. Okay. And whenever you have the presence of this, not the Sabbath, but Sabbaths, if Sabbaths is what's in play, then we're talking about those first day Sabbaths and those last day Sabbaths that are attached to festivals. How do I know that? Because when Paul uses this language, food, drink, festival, new moon, Sabbath. Okay? Look at those. food, drink, festival, new moon, Sabbath, or just that last pairing, new moon and Sabbath. Does that show up anywhere else in Scripture? The answer is yes. And so for an example, I'm going to go to 1 Chronicles chapter 23, verse 31. And what do we see there? Wherever burnt offerings were offered, food and drink, on to Yahweh on Sabbaths, plural, new moons, feast days, context, right? So what kind of Sabbaths do you suppose we're talking about there? New moons. Well, what is a new moon? What does new moon have to do with anything? For that, sorry, I got ahead of myself. For that, a new moon, again, if you think of a lunar calendar that's used to track your calendar, your feast days, your festivals, your holy times, you go to Psalm 81:3, and you have this: blow the trumpet at the new moon, at the full moon, on our feast day, at our festival time. So new moon and full moon, if you're using a lunar calendar, had to do with your feast days, with your festival days, okay? And so new moon is festival and feast language. So if we go back to 1 Chronicles chapter 23:31, you've got what? You've got burnt offerings, Sabbaths, new moons, feast days. Do you think those are talking about your first and your last Sabbaths? Yes. That is the most natural way to read that from the context. 2 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 4. Behold, I am about to build a house for my name of Yahweh, my God, and dedicate it to him, for the burning of incense, of sweet spices before him, for the regular arrangement of the showbread, for burnt offerings, morning and evening, on the Sabbaths, and the new moons, and the appointed feasts of Yahweh our God, as ordained forever for Israel. Okay, so here we have, again, not Sabbath singular, but Sabbaths plural. And it's in the context of feast days. Okay, and by the way, where does the first and last Sabbath show up? That's in Leviticus 23. I don't think we have time to go there. But Leviticus 23 lists out all of the festivals of Israel. And what do you find? Each one tends to start with a new moon Sabbath or a full moon. Each one tends to start with the first Sabbath and end with the last Sabbath. 2 Chronicles 31:3 is my next one. 2 Chronicles chapter 31, verse 3. The contribution of the king from his own possessions was for the burnt offerings, again, food and drink of morning and evening, burnt offerings for the Sabbaths, the new moons, the appointed feasts. Are you starting to see a pattern? Okay? So when Paul, in Colossians 2:13, raises this issue, 16, therefore let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food or drink, the offerings, or with regard to a festival, new moon, or a Sabbath. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, but wait a minute, that looks singular to me. And at this point, I will say, if somebody can help me with this, I'd be open to the help. But in Greek, it's plural. In Greek, it is Sabbaths. The word is plural. I looked it up. It's Sabbaths. In some English translations, it says Sabbaths. In some, it says Sabbath. And I don't know why. It could be one of those instances. There are some words in Greek and in Hebrew that are always plural, wherever they show up, which would make this argument a bit more complicated. And I didn't think Sabbath was one of those words, but it might be. And so if somebody can help me with that, I'm open to it. But I looked it up in my Greek text and in my interlinear, and it is plural. Okay, and so it might be just based on context. They've decided to handle it like one of the instances of Sabbath of the Sabbaths, the festival ones. But in the context, here's my point. Paul is talking about these patterns of festivals: new moon, food and drink, festival, new moon, Sabbath. That's all language surrounding the special feast days and celebration days in Israel's calendar. And so what's actually being said here is, if you don't celebrate Israel's calendar, don't let anyone pass judgment on you for that. Okay? Very important clarification to make. Colossians 2:16 is not a rejection of the fourth commandment. Okay, so that's all that I've got for you for today, other than a reminder that grace and peace are yours because Jesus said so, and he doesn't lie. He's going to take care of his people in this and every circumstance, and that doesn't mean that everything's going to go well for us, but it does mean that until the last day, when we enter into the full rest of resurrected new world, new heavens and new earth, new creation, until we get to that rest, the Lord has given us a Sabbath rest to practice that is meant to be a preview for that coming reality. And so I commend it to you. I encourage you to maybe think about just one way that you could, something you could add to your practices of Sabbath keeping, or to start practices of Sabbath keeping, and see if it doesn't do you some good. Just see if it doesn't do you some good. So with that, again, grace and peace yours because Jesus said so. He doesn't lie. Rest in that today and every day. See you guys later. Bye-bye. Now, can I figure out how to shut the stream off? Here we go. Bye, everyone.